Well, thank you very much. Hola! Buenas tardes. I'm afraid that's the end of my Spanish, but I'll try and speak clearly and slowly. This is what I'd like to talk about. I thought for some of you I'll be reminding you of the stages of clinical trials. Then I want to talk, why are clinical trials so important? Why do they matter? What are the problems with clinical trials? Because there are many, many problems with clinical trials, not just in the developing world, but in the developed world as well. And then I want to argue the case for bringing transparency, opening up the process. That's what I'm going to talk about. These are the different stages of clinical trials. So there are preclinical studies when you're developing a new possible drug, research in cells and animals. And then phase naught, as it's sometimes called, you begin to possibly test it in very minute doses in human beings. And then you come to a phase 1 trial, which is the very first test in human beings, usually healthy volunteers, and you're trying to work out if the drug is safe. And we had a very spectacular case in London of where a whole series of people were given a drug and had the most appalling reactions and were in hospital for months afterwards. So that stage can go badly wrong. And then in phase 2, you're trying to work out, what is the dose that we'll need to give of the drug, and do we have some evidence that it will actually work? And often when people are talking about clinical trials, they're actually talking about phase 3, which is the randomized controlled trial to work out whether the drug actually works, is it efficacious, and to get some information on safety. You don't get that much information because you're giving it to a limited number of people, and sometimes drug side effects will happen to only 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 people. And those kinds of those phase 3 trials have to be done for drugs to be put on the market. And then after they're on the market, you have phase 4 trials, which are often called post-marketing surveillance. So you try to keep a record of many people who get the drug, and there you're particularly interested in safety. But even there, you may not pick up safety problems. It may need to go to hundreds of thousands of people before some problems emerge. So those are the different types of trials. Often when people are talking about clinical trials, they're talking about phase 3 trials, the randomized trials. So why are they so important? Well, I think medicine would agree that they are the best way of testing a new intervention, not just drugs, but potentially any intervention. But they're particularly good for drugs because it's a fairly simple intervention. A very complicated social intervention can be hard to test in a randomized trial. And for the pharmaceutical industry, they're very important because you have to do these trials in order to get a drug on the market. And as such, they have huge economic importance. I mean, it costs probably $500 million to get a drug to market, so it's a very expensive process. But there are lots and lots of problems with clinical trials. They are not a panacea, and I think it's important to remember these problems. So there is always the problem of generalizing from the very well-done clinical trial to the real messy world. In the jargon of medicine, that's called moving from efficacy to effectiveness. So things that might work in the very tightly controlled circumstances of a clinical trial may not be so effective when used in a much broader, messier population. But you can actually do effectiveness trials, and often, perhaps we'll hear more of that, there are arguments that there should be more effectiveness trials rather than efficacy trials. There's always the problem for individual doctors. How do you move from evidence on a population to evidence on an individual? Just because 10% of people may be improved by a treatment doesn't tell you whether the particular patient in front of you is going to be improved. Many, many trials are far too small. Arguably, the British Medical Journal published the first randomised trial, a trial of streptomycin in tuberculosis back in 1948. And in 1998, we published a theme issue celebrating 50 years of trials, and there was an analysis of all of the trials on schizophrenia, and the conclusion was that most of them were faulty in one way or another, and particularly they're often too small, because many drugs do not have a dramatic effect as sort of penicillin does for pneumonia or meningitis. Many drugs have rather a small effect, so unless you do a very big trial, you may miss an effect that can be important. They are very hard to do well, and lots of people do trials that are not done well. There's a big problem of bias. And that's why supposedly they should be double-blind and randomised to try and get round the problem of bias. But as I'll show you in a minute, there's still lots of evidence of bias. They are rather easily manipulated. I mean, although they are the sort of gold standard test for a new drug, there are many ways in which people can manipulate the results. And obviously, if you've got a big financial incentive for doing so, it's very tempting to do that. Then there is the problem of funding, that most drug trials are funded by the drug industry, which clearly has an interest in a particular kind of result. And there's a growing argument that I'm sure we'll discuss more during the evening that there ought to be public funding of trials because the public doesn't have the same bias. And I've learned today in Barcelona there is such funding available in Spain. And then there's also lots of evidence that trials are very poorly reported. So there are many problems. Let me concentrate for a little while, though, on bias. This is a study that was published in 1994 in the Archives of Internal Medicine that I think has a kind of huge significance. It was done by some Canadian researchers. They went and found all the randomised trials of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. There are many of these drugs and they're used predominantly for arthritis. And all of these trials were sponsored by industry. And the drug being investigated, that is the sponsor's drug owned by the company, was as good as the comparative treatment in 3/4 of the studies and better in 1/4. And there wasn't a single trial where the result was worse for the sponsor's drug, which is kind of deeply implausible. How could that happen? Because theoretically, when you do a clinical trial, you should be in something called equipoise. You don't know really whether this drug will be beneficial or it won't be beneficial. It could even be harmful. So to come up with 69 where every single one works in the favour of the sponsor is very disturbing and suggests bias. And since that study, there have been many, many others looking at studies funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And to cut a long story short, they consistently find that there's a strong bias towards the industry on the whole comes up with the answer it wants. And when you reflect that in the major journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, the Lancet, 70% of the trials they publish are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, you can see that there's a very serious bias in that whole process. And here's a study that was published just recently in PLOS Medicine, Public Library of Science Medicine. They made a comparison between all the trials that had to be submitted to get a drug onto a market to the Food and Drug Administration in the US. So they looked at 909 drugs between 1998 and 2000. You have to submit every single one of trials that you have done in order to get a license. And they wanted to know how many of these were published subsequently. And only 43% were published. So half of these trials were never published. And lo and behold, the studies that were published gave a very distorted view of the value of the drugs. The positive trials were published. And then there was this study very recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is effectively showing the same kind of thing. So all of the trials for these 12 antidepressants submitted to the FDA, there were 74 studies. The Food and Drug Administration said, well, we think 38 of these are positive. They're supporting the value of the drug, and 37 of those were published. That meant there were 36 that were negative or questionable. They weren't producing evidence in favour of the drug. Only 3 of those were published, and 11 of them were actually published as positive results. So there'd been a kind of distortion between when the trial was submitted to the FDA and when it actually appeared in a journal. So you get by reading journals and studying published studies, you get a very distorted view of the effect of these drugs.